Good evening. This is Allison Morse. I've invited you all here this evening to attend a very special presentation by David Lepofsky. So you will have had a couple of bulletins from me. I am the Senior Manager at Easter Seals, Ontario, responsible for advocacy and family engagement. So as part of both our advocacy efforts and our family engagement, we are starting to provide some presentations to families. And I'm hoping that you all will gain some important insights tonight around special education. So this session is going to be for 90 minutes. We're going to cover about 6 major topics. I am going to ask our moderator if there are any questions in the chat on YouTube, and so that those questions can be asked of David at the end of each topic. We'll also have some time at the end to take questions. So again, if you want to make any questions while you're attending this evening on YouTube, use the YouTube chat box to enter your question, and we have a moderator who's watching for those questions. So in terms of my introduction tonight is that David has become a friend of mine over the last 4 years as we've worked together on the Education Accessibility Standard Committee. But David has been to the forefront of accessibility advocacy for many, many years. He's going to talk tonight about the importance of the individual education plan and the identification, placement, and review committee process, especially during the current pandemic. David is a Canadian lawyer and disability advocate. Now retired from his position as General Counsel in Toronto, David teaches at the University of Toronto and at Osgoode Hall Law School. Blind for much of his life, Lepofsky, I don't like saying that. I prefer to say David. I should have changed my script. David is the chair of the Accessibility for Ontarians with Disabilities Alliance. He has been a leading advocate for over 25 years, and he led the charge for the Accessibility for Ontarians with Disabilities Act. And he continues to advocate on the Accessibility Standard Development Committees, making recommendations for accessibility standards for customer service, education, employment, health, information, and communication. So as you can gather, David has a wealth of experience and knowledge. And tonight we're focusing on special education because that is the job of our kids. And we want to be able to, as family members, advocate for them to make sure they get the best education possible. So my first question, David, is, my child has a disability and will be starting school in the fall. Should I tell the school about my child's disability?
Okay, number one, it's great to talk to you all, and it's great to be here with my friend Allison. We have collaborated extensively, not only on pointing out where there are areas where improvements need to be made to ensure the effective education of all kids with disabilities, but also to come up with practical solutions that can really work. And I'm drawing on that experience tonight as I answer your questions. Our education system is staffed, I believe, from top to bottom by educators, staff, principals who want to do the best for our kids, but they're working in an education system which is unfortunately designed on an outdated model that kind of assumes it's there to serve the kids of the needs of students without disabilities. So students with disabilities find that they're kind of behind the 8 ball and often need to have adjustments, accommodations, added supports for them because they don't fit the one-size-fits-all design of the education system. That design gets in the way of teachers and principals and other educators who want to do the best for our kids. But if you want to ask the school system to make those adjustments, you can't expect them to do it if they don't know that your child has education and learning related education needs by virtue of a disability. Often disabilities are invisible. I'm a blind guy, I use a white cane. If you're sighted, I walk in the room, you don't have to guess. You can tell that I can't see. But when I sit down, if you walked in the room and my cane's sitting on the floor beside me, unless you're sighted and on all, your hands and knees looking under the desk, you won't know I'm blind. So how will you know if waving at me even works as a way to say hi? Well, that's the situation our school system is in. And therefore, it is really important, if you want the school system to meet your child's needs, to let them know as early as possible, both about their disability and, to the extent you can, about what those needs are, so that you can work with them on changing them. Now, if Allison and I and the organizations we're affiliated with and that we collaborated with on the committee we worked on are eventually successful, we could end up with a school system that is far more flexible in its design, that is designed to meet the needs of children with a wide spectrum of different learning needs and learning styles. But until that day, we have to make sure that the school system is alerted about our children's needs, and then we have to be involved as advocates to try to ensure that the school system meets those needs.
So thank you, David. So in terms of disclosure, which is what it's called when you tell the school system, you do have control of the information. It doesn't mean you need to share every single report that's ever been written about your child, but it does put an obligation on you to organize that information and share the most critical information that they're going to need in order to support your child at school.
Look at it this way. If you show up, if a child showed up in class on their first day who's totally deaf, and the school board didn't know about it, they've got people who are trained to work as teachers of the deaf and so on. But if they don't know, they're not making sure you're in the right place and that you're working with staff who know how to meet your needs. So the child is going to be at a huge disadvantage. I mean, I'm stating the obvious, but that if you take it from that sort of obvious example to other disabilities, it's the same. Now, you may also be uncertain what those what the disability related learning needs are. That's when you try to work with them. And as Allison said, you want to marshal the information that can help them. Think of school teachers and principals and other educators as people who want to do the best for our kids, but they're kind of behind the eight ball. They're really busy. And during the pandemic, they're really behind the eight ball because they're busy and they're trying to learn how to teach remotely and deal with social distancing and so on. And B, they're working in an education system that, as I mentioned before, handcuffs them to some extent. It's not their fault, but they're trying to work within a system that can hold them back. You can help liberate them. And one of the ways you do that is making sure they have all the information about your child that they need. Otherwise, they have to figure it out themselves, and there's a risk they'll get it wrong. Back to you.
Robin, has anyone put any questions in related to this question?
No questions yet, Allison.
All right, thanks, Robin. So the next question I have is that the teacher has spoken to me about a school team meeting and developing an IEP for my daughter. What is an IEP?
Okay, let's talk about this. This is really important. I've already talked about the fact that they need to make some adjustments or adaptations for your child. And those adaptations can be as varied as kids are. Remember that I said it's a kind of a one-size-fits-all education system designed for kids without disabilities. What the school needs to do is to find out what the child's needs are, disability-related learning needs are, and how best to meet them. And what you want the school to do is then create a plan on how they're going to meet them. It should identify what the needs are and talk about the measures they're going to implement and the outcomes they're going to look for. So that plan is the roadmap. Now, whether we formalize it or keep it informal, we want a plan. And under our Education Act, they give that plan a name. And it's called an Individual Education Plan, or IEP. The concept, I believe, emanates from the United States. This has been around for a long time. And like any big organization, they can get kind of bureaucratic about these things, but forget all the technical language. It's the roadmap that sets out what your child's disability-related learning needs are, what they're prepared to do to achieve, what goals that they want to achieve, and what added supports or strategies they will put in place to get those made. Now, you mentioned a meeting. This is really important. If I'm able to help you with anything over the time we're talking today, and I hope that Allison and I could share a number of helpful ideas. I want the alarm bells to go off or the music to notionally crescendo right now. It is open to you to ask the school to have a meeting with you and anybody that can help you to bring along to work on writing that IEP, that individual education plan. I like to give it a fancy formal name, call it an IEP meeting. A lot of teachers and principals don't even know that term. It's in the United States, parents have a right to an IEP meeting, a meeting with the school staff where they will collaborate on the writing of the IEP. In Ontario and in Canada, I believe, school boards tend to just sort of write you, ask you what input you'd like to have, and then maybe send it home and let you know if you want to talk to them, you can. Parents who know better, who know more than some school boards will share, know to ask for an IEP meeting. Now, whether you call it that or not, doesn't matter. Say, look, can we have a meeting with the principal and the teacher and anybody else that the school thinks would be helpful to discuss what you think or what the school thinks should be in the IEP. And hopefully they can provide you with some examples of what they're thinking, including maybe even a draft of it. And you could come and bring with you anyone that you think might help you. It may be some specialists that you're working with your child to discuss it. What it will turn into or can turn into is kind of like an oral report card, not fancy and formalized, just a progress report. Here's what we're thinking of doing. And you might find it very helpful as a place for you to give your ideas. Say, hey, you know what, we tried that at home and we didn't work. We tried this instead. We think it worked better. Or how about if we do the following at home that'll help you out? Whatever it may be, that dialogue will really help. So whether or not the school tells you they're having a meeting about it, or whether or not they invite you to a meeting, ask for one. That will make a huge difference. And you know, the Standards Development Committee that Allison and I serve on have recommendations out for public comment. And in it, we recommend that all parents should, as a matter of right, be offered an IEP meeting for a student with a disability, because that really is the fairest way. I do know, last point, that those parents who know to ask, the school will oblige. You now know to ask, so go for it. Back to you, Allison.
So one of the things that in terms of the IEP, and David has sort of mentioned it, is that it can feel fairly bureaucratic, especially if you're sent a draft IEP and you've never heard of it before and you don't know what it is. So it is really important that you ask for that meeting. And in addition, ask questions. So whether it's the teacher, the principal, or a special education teacher that can give you more information, get a good understanding of what the IEP is and what are the contents of it. On the Easter Seal Kids at School information blog, there's a number of articles on the IEP going through section by section what is on the IEP and what it means. And so essentially it is the place where you record things like, what are my child's strengths, things that they do well. And you always want them to come before the things that they have as needs. We want very much to work from a strength-based approach to the IEP. So in the IEP, we're recording what their strengths are, what their needs are, and this needs to be supported by documentation. So for example, if you're just starting school, you may have some reports from physicians or from the preschool system, the preschool speech and language program. And so those reports are all pieces of information that can inform the plan. Similarly, as your child gets older, the school board will be doing some assessments of the child's learning, and they will have some pieces of information that they will also record and share with you as you develop that plan. And then, as David says, it is the plan of how they're going to support your child. And there's a number of supports that can include. Some of them are accommodations. One of the very simple environmental accommodations that helps a lot of children to learn better is sitting closer to the teacher. That can be a very effective strategy. For some kids, and when we're talking about Easter Seals clients, a lot of them have needs for specialized equipment, whether it's for communication or in terms of adaptive equipment for them to be able to learn, or eventually assistive technology. So all of this needs to be documented so that you have in the plan what's going to be provided. The other piece is in terms of human resources. They are also documented in the individual education plan. One of the misconceptions of the IEP is that the parent must sign it. The parent can sign it, and I recommend that if you, at the end of the process, you make any comments in the parent consultation section. But ultimately, the principal is the one that is responsible for signing off. The principal is accountable that those supports and accommodations that have been documented in the IEP are being provided to the student. David, do you have any tips for families in terms of monitoring the IEP?
Well, let me tell you this. As Allison and I are talking, some of you watching this may go, oh my God, I've never done this before. And it's a big school system, and I'm the one who knows the least about all of the ins and outs of this. And I want to offer you a resource that can help you. Being aware that there are a lot of parents who just don't know how to navigate this. I recorded a video last fall, which is on tips for parents on how to advocate for your child at school. And I talk about the IEP meeting and what you might do, or other ways to have your influence in the IEP, but I talk about other strategies too. If we can post the link to it, it's on YouTube, it's captioned. I've gotten very encouraging feedback on it. It's been seen over 2,000 times. I hope you'll like it, hope you'll find it useful, and share it with others, because it will give you tips. Now, the benefit of the IEP, rest assured, just because something is written in the IEP doesn't mean the school can't do it. It's helpful for you when things are written in there, because that's a commitment that the school will do it. It's also helpful if you think of a child a student in secondary school. They've got a lot of teachers. Any teacher who has a student who's got an IEP should be given the IEP, we would hope. And so it's a way to communicate with teachers even before you, or even if you never get to talk to them directly. However, how do we know in a big school board that the school board's actually going to do what the IEP says? Sometimes they do. Too often they don't. What we don't have in place but need is an effective system of auditing to make sure school boards are doing what they said they do. But if you either have a school that won't put something in the IEP that you think is important, or they put something in and they're not doing it, you have some recourse. Now, this is harder during COVID, because the usual way you check up on this is drop in on the school. And of course, during COVID, either they're not at school, or if they are at school, you can't go in. So this has been a hardship for parents of kids with disabilities. But what you can do if you're not happy either with the content of the IEP or with whether they're effectively implementing it, there are several steps you can take. The first step is to talk to the teacher and the principal. My video goes into this in greater length. I'm giving you a summary. If that's unsuccessful, you can go up the hierarchy in the school board. We hope that families don't have to resort to lawyering up and going to the Human Rights Tribunal, because that is a costly, adversarial, and time-consuming process. Now, it's there, it's important. Some people have to use it. I regret that anyone does. But what we want at school boards, and what the committee that Allison and I sit on has recommended, is that there should be a fast, fair, informal, specialist-driven internal kind of dispute resolution system where you could raise issues within the board with people who know something about educating students with disabilities, not just higher level administrative types, and where you could try to at least broker a solution. As a practical matter, as within any organization, it's a people thing. So to the extent that you can think of ways to persuade them to do what it is you want, it's helpful to do that. In the video I gave some practical tips for that. Allison, back to you.
Okay. So I agree that you definitely want to follow the communication protocol and go through the different levels in terms of taking your concern forward. But I also think that we hear over and over again, there isn't enough money, we can't provide this. And I think it's really important that you as a parent have a role in advocating to say, what is it you think is expensive? What is it you can't provide? What other alternative solutions can we come forward with? So to me, it's always about problem solving. They should not be using the excuse that they can't afford it. And if they are, you want to really understand what they're saying. And then you want to verify that and follow up the chain. In fact, our school boards in Ontario are very well funded for the services they provide. And it's just maybe that at this point in time, we don't have the adequate human resources, or we don't have the money for the equipment. But I think it's always important to challenge those kinds of comments.
If I can just add to that, I mean, in my career, have dealt with this whole issue of large organizations saying, oh, we don't have the money. This is again where there may be handcuffs on the person you're dealing with. The teacher or even the principal doesn't usually run any budget. They may not have something, but they can ask higher ups to get it. And it's helpful to find out from them who can approve this. And everybody, of course, always says they're out of money, but then there's always, budget for other stuff. So it's what we know from advocacy here in the States, elsewhere, is that parents who advocate for their kids move things forward more than those who are passive and don't. It's sad that that's the case. I wish we had a system that didn't require parents to do that, but it is the case. And that's why I put that video together, to give practical advocacy tips on how to do it in a way that's practical for a parent who's not trained in this and wants to succeed. Back to you.
Okay, thank you. Robin, have we had any questions around the IEP?
No questions right now.
Okay, is this a reminder to anyone that's watching that they can use the chat function on YouTube to put in any questions, and then they'll be forwarded to us for answering. So we've talked about the IEP, David. The other piece that families are often not familiar with is the IPRC. So I've got a question here. The school has suggested that my child should move to another school for a special education class placement, and that we need an IPRC. What is an IPRC?
Okay, let me begin by saying, before I describe it practically, I'm going to show my attitude. I think this whole system of which we're going to talk about is outdated, bureaucratic, unhelpful, and needs to be dramatically rewritten, replaced, or something. Dating back to like 1980, before we had a Charter of Rights, before the Human Rights protected kids with disabilities, our Education Act was amended to require school boards to actually educate all kids with disabilities. I know that seems like it's ancient history, but it had to happen. And in that, for its day, major step forward, they provided for a system that would decide on the placement of a child. What does placement mean? I don't know. The Education Act doesn't say, the regulations don't say, but it's a decision over where the student is placed, not what the services are and supports they get. What's the difference between a placement, a service, a program, and a support? It doesn't say that either. So, and I genuinely am baffled by this system. But for you as parents, what you're going to find out is the school board may say that where your child is placed, not what specific school, but the category of program he or she is placed in, may have to be decided by a committee. It's called an Identification and Placement Review committee or IPRC. And you're scratching your head going, what is it? Do I have say? Who's involved? How does it work? You can ask the school board to explain all of this. In short, it's a committee of the school board. It's school staff. And you're supposed to be able to attend, hear what the school proposes. They're supposed to hear what you propose. They're supposed to decide, and then it can even be appealed to a tribunal. But a lot of school boards will only tell you you only get a few minutes. I know one school board that will not tell, at least some of their staff won't even tell the family what they're going to propose for the child. It's a bit surreal. Half at least of special education students in Ontario don't even use it. They have an IEP, but they don't have one to go to one of these committees. It's a more involved process than I can summarize here. I am hoping that it doesn't become necessary in a child's life. If it does, you should ask the principal and the special education consultant to take you by the hand, explain every step of it. You are entitled to have a lawyer there, but you may not well need one. And you want to find out what it's about, what they're going to decide. And if you want, put your case together. What I find is the most helpful is to try to sit down with the school board officials, the principal, the special education consultant, and see if you can work on an agreement. We all agree that the following is the best appropriate placement, because then you can go before the committee hand in hand and make your case. Some school boards are likely open to doing that. Others, they're so bureaucratic, they might go, oh, we don't do that. And I've heard of that too. But in the end, what you want to do, what you care about is not artificial distinctions between what's called program, what's called accommodation, what's called placement, what's called a support, what's called a service. That's all a bunch of mumbo jumbo. You want to make sure your child is educated in the most appropriate program to meet their needs, with the appropriate teacher, the appropriate peer setting, and all the supports they need. And you don't divide it up into little artificial categories the way the school board does. And I am hoping in the future we won't even have to have this conversation. Back to you, Allison.
But unfortunately, right now, we still do.
We still do.
We know that
I agree.
parents are being invited to IPRCs. So under the regulation, you must be invited. Obviously, they can't require you to attend, but my advice is always to attend any meeting they invite you to, even if it means changing your schedule or having to find somebody to take care of your kids. It's really important when you have an invitation to a meeting to attend it. And so I also recommend that this shouldn't be a surprise to you. That if you have been working collaboratively with the school team, it should have been a mutually agreeable decision as to what is going to be in the meeting in terms of the child's exceptionality, in terms of the child's placement. And so that it should be a consensus-driven process. But as David has alluded to, it often becomes adversarial. Unfortunately, because of the way the regulations have been written, it really focuses on this thing called placement, when in fact, what is important to all of us is the program that's going to be provided to our child. So I strongly recommend that you attend the IPRC, and that I would not recommend you signing it while you're there. I think even if it was a consensus decision, you want to take time to look at it and see what it says before you actually sign off on it. In some places,
and you can get legal advice and representation if you talk to a family lawyer or other lawyers. You can find someone who knows something about this. My long-term goal is to get more lawyers educated in education law so that they can help families out of this, but some know.
Well, of course, not every family can afford a lawyer. So
of course, absolutely.
So this is where organizations like Easter Seals Ontario, Learning Disabilities Association, Autism Ontario, all of them have supports for families around the education system.
And so if you need somebody to give you some advice, one place you can turn to is the Arch Disability Law Center, which has a summary free advice service. And they are very familiar with education law. And I think they're doing another session for Easter Seals this week. And I strongly commend their work, and they've got resources in this area that they've developed that are worth checking out.
Yeah, so there are resources to help you with the IPRC. And if you disagree with the decision, entering into the appeal process. But ideally, we avoid that, that we do get an agreement, everything's going smoothly, and then the focus of the discussion can be much more around the individual education plan and how they're going to support your child at school. Robin, do we have any questions about the IPRC?
No questions, Allison.
Thank you, Robin. So we've been talking about these processes that have been going on for many years inside the school system, but we know that a lot of things have been impacted by COVID-19 and the pandemic. And the number one result has been that our students have been home for much of the past 15 months. Since March of 2020, they have been home for long periods of time, doing their education virtually, with teachers and children looking at each other through a screen. So what does this mean for special education? The IPRC should be held every year. The IEP should be reviewed every semester. So are these processes still taking place? The ministry tells us that they are, but the evidence I'm hearing from families is that some of these processes have been disrupted. So going back to some practical ideas, my child has an IEP, but the school is not providing all of the accommodations described in the IEP while my child is working at home. What can I do?
Okay. Number one, COVID doesn't change a child's entitlement with respect to IEPs or IPRCs at all. So if there's been a breakdown, it's not permitted. This is where parental advocacy comes into place. Now, frankly, and ironically, even though COVID has caused real setback for too many students with disabilities, there is one opportunity that it's bequeathed to all of us, which is, of course, we can now do Zoom meetings. So if you want a meeting with the school team, you can have a virtual one, and you can ask for one, whether it's on the IEP, or you want to ask for an IPRC, or you think there should have been one, but there isn't. You can email them and say, I'd like to have a meeting. Could we have a virtual meeting? Could we schedule it? And of course, we can do it safely through a virtual, through Zoom or whatever. And you can, it's actually easier for you to do than having to schlep down to the school, take time out of your workday. So it actually makes it easier. If you, as a parent, have a disability, you have a right to be accommodated in this process. So for example, as I mentioned, I'm blind. Some virtual platforms are more accessible than others. They've been getting better during COVID, but for example, last year, the Toronto District School Board basically was offering to do IPRCs in WebEx. WebEx at the time was completely inaccessible. It's gotten somewhat better, but it's certainly not preferred. I and others raised complaints about this, and TDSB eventually agreed to make Zoom available as an alternative. There's one other school board that is, I understand, not allowing the use of Zoom at all, which is inexcusable, and a Ministry of Education that's not tightening things up to make sure this doesn't happen. But if you need a particular platform to accommodate your need, or any other accommodation in these meetings, you should tell the school board and ask for those accommodations, and they are required to provide them unless they can prove it's an undue hardship to the whole school board. If you're concerned that your child's needs are not being met in either what's in the IEP in general or specifically COVID related, let's talk about it. First, there are additional learning needs that may well have arisen by virtue of COVID. if your child has a disability that affects their ability to participate in distance learning, they may need some additional accommodations. It's open to you to say, I want the IEP amended to include those. And I mean, your bottom line is whether or not it's in the document, you want the accommodations provided. And by the way, the IEP is not a fixed thing where once they decide on it in October, like that's it for the year. At any time, if new things come up, you can ask them to revisit it, revisit the accommodations they've provided. And a school board can't turn to you and say, oh, well, you may need that. We may be able to do it, but it's not in the IP, so we don't have to do it. It doesn't work that way at all. But if you have learning needs, that your child has learning needs that are related to needing supports during the additional supports during distance learning, you should be raising that with the school. If they're provided, great. If they're not, take it up the ladder, the hierarchy, as we discussed here briefly, and as my video that we give you the link to also explains. Unfortunately, this is another situation where school boards have been put in an awkward position, because often these same needs recur for students with the same disability in 72 different school boards, but the province has opted not to mandate consistent practices or minimum practices. They've left it to each school board to figure out what to do. And that means that school boards struggling to deal with the pandemic, given a one-size-fits-all solution, distance learning or social distancing, have had to sort of figure out on their own, well, what the heck do we do with kids with a particular disability? And sadly to say, it's again the parents who do the more advocacy that seem to get more solutions. And again, principals and teachers, because they're busy over their heads trying to figure out how to do this distance teaching, will be in a position where if you could deliver solutions to them, give them ideas on how to try things, that will be give you a better chance of succeeding. The other thing I'd like you to do is to encourage you to have an eye on the fall. So let's hope that during the fall we will have been vaccinated and we'll be back to closer to, if not a normal world with schools reopening. Of course, all kids who've been dealing with distance learning are going to be set back some compared to where they would have been during over the past year and a bit. However, I believe that students with disabilities in a number of cases are going to be set back even further. So if I can give you an example, if any of your kids have both a mobility disability and vision loss, and they needed to learn Braille, well, Braille is a hands-on learning thing where a teacher is usually working in the room with the student. Not something you could so easily teach by remote control over a Zoom meeting. So those kids, in terms of that vision-related teaching, I know this is not normally an Easter sales thing, but it's an illustration that's going to help you. They're going to be behind. They've lost hours and hours of Braille instruction. So a number of us have said school boards need to do a surge in that kind of training when these kids get back to school, not only to pick them up from the ground they lost, but actually move them to where they should have been had we not had to go through this. I encourage you to look at your child's needs, and if there are particular supports, it might be health-related things like physio or occupational therapy, speech language pathology, or other kinds of specialized supports, which normally they'd only get a certain amount per week. It's worth telling the school board now in early June that when your child's back in school in September, you're going to need more. And that helps the principal, if they don't have those hours, go to their higher ups and try to get them. And if they say no, you want lead time on that now so you could take it up the ladder to try to get those supports for your children as a post-COVID way to try to overcome some of the hardships that COVID's imposed. Back to you.
So I'm just going to follow up on that point specifically. So many of our kids that are supported by Easter Seals, they do require physiotherapy and occupational therapy services at school. And so one of the big losses over the last 18 months has been the lack of that therapy programs developed by the therapists employed by the children's treatment centers, but more importantly, the daily delivery of the program by educational assistants. So I've heard from a lot of parents about the loss physically, things that they have lost being able to do, range of motion, the tightening of contractures, other things that have been negatively affected their bodies, which are going to need quite a lot of extra rehabilitation, which might not have been necessary had we not gone to remote learning. So that's one of the things that parents do need to be advocating, but recognizing that that is in fact a shared responsibility between health, or Ministry of Children, Community and Social Services, and the Ministry of Education, so that we want those things to be thought about in advance. So by raising those concerns, hopefully we can have those programs back in place in the fall. In terms of learning, we've heard from a lot of parents where children that have a physical disability and other disabilities, for example, autism or a developmental disability, have really struggled with remote learning. A lot of that is not being able to attend to a screen, not being able to attend for long periods, and having difficulty engaging them. So these students will have lost even more in terms of their learning over the last 18 months. So it is really important that if you have an opportunity for a meeting around your IEP this month in June, that you start talking about that transition to school in the fall and the plans for learning recovery. I have heard that many school boards have plans to do some new assessments, but there are a lot of kids who've fallen behind, and it's going to take a lot of time. And so it's up to you to advocate for your child and making sure that they are going to have the supports and services they need in place in the fall. Robin, did we have any questions about IEPs during COVID?
No questions, Alison.
Right.
Let me just offer people a little more, if I could just interrupt this program for a commercial announcement. No, it's not really a commercial announcement. If you'd like to learn more about the advocacy that we are doing at a provincial level to advocate for inclusive education and fully barrier-free education, you heard from Allison that the AODA Alliance, which I chair, has been doing advocacy on this. We've been battling for over 11 years now to get the province to enact a new regulation to tear down these barriers in our education system. We're not partisan. We work with any political party, and it was our efforts that led to the appointment of the Standards Development Committee that Allison and I are on, which has been a really exciting opportunity. We'd love you to learn more about what we're doing. So if you'd like to just take a note, if you're watching this on your computer, you can deal with this just as we're going. I'm going to give you 3 options. If you go on the internet, you go to our website, it's AODAalliance.org, www.aodaalliance.org. Right on the homepage, there's a sign up link. Paste in your email address and sign up. You'll get our updates. You'll hear what we're doing on a number of fronts, not just education, but we've done a lot on education. We'll be doing a lot more. And we are eager when we hear when people follow us, but also when people hit reply and give us their feedback. Say, hey, you folks are doing a good job, or hey, you're missing this important barrier, or hey, we don't agree with the point you made there. That is really informative and helpful, but we'll also give you action tips, and we're always looking for input. So the first thing is sign up. Second, if you're a Twitter person, I love Twitter. Follow us on Twitter at AODA Alliance, AODA Alliance. Please follow us, and you can retweet our tweets. We can get cheeky on occasion. That's what Twitter's like, but we have fun and we try to be respectful. And you can also, through our Twitter feed, learn what's going on. Good news and not as good news from around Ontario, across Canada, indeed around the world. And that's helpful. Finally, on Facebook, we have a Facebook page. You can like us. You can share our posts. It's called the Accessibility for Ontarians with Disabilities Act Alliance. back to our regularly scheduled program. Allison.
All right. So similarly, Easter Seals has lots of messaging that they send out through social media and a Facebook page, but it has not been very strongly focused on the advocacy and in particular special education. But this summer, I'm going to be sending out lots of information through social media around the accessibility standards recommendations, because we need to hear from people. David and I sort of have a utopian view of how things could be improved, but we know that there's lots of practical considerations. We also want to find out what's more important to families. So which of the issues that we've made recommendations about, which of these are important to you and which ones do you feel really strongly about? So we'll be looking for feedback in a variety of ways, whether it's the AODA Alliance or Easter Seals. Potentially, I'm looking to hold some forums over the summer and or send out some surveys. So we're looking at different ways to capture people's information and perspective on the standards.
Just to explain how this all works, we've written, and just yesterday the government released a package of things that we say are the changes that are needed. It's long, but you could read the summaries, or you could just skip the discussions and read the recommendations. But we've tried to map out as a committee what we think there should be. And this is a very practical package. We've got folks like Allison and I who are from the disability perspective, but we were equally populated by folks from the school boards, public and Catholic, from the teachers unions, from education professionals. And so our discussions weren't just, hey, wouldn't it be lovely to have X, but hey, how do you do that in a small school board in the North? And we've tried to balance all of that. We've got initial recommendations out. What happens this summer up until September 2nd is you can give feedback to the government. Here's what I like, here's what I don't like, here's what you missed. And you can give that feedback to Easter Seals and the AODA Alliance too. And we'll share it with the committee. All that feedback, one way or other, gets to our committee. Then our job this fall on this advisory committee, both the disability sector reps and the education sector reps, is we'll take all of that, inhale it all, look at our package of reforms and say, all right, here's what we forgot to include. Here's what maybe we should adjust, and here's what we should leave the same. So telling us something's good helps us. That means, hey, that's worth keeping. And telling us of a barrier we didn't contemplate, that helps us. Telling us that a solution we came up with what we thought was good, but you don't think it'll work, you got a better idea, that helps us too. Back to you.
So the public consultation process is going to be really important. And it really, initially, when they were preparing for this development of the Standard Development Committee, they actually did public consultation, and they heard from hundreds of parents across the province about the barriers. A lot of people think when we're talking about accessibility, it's physical accessibility. And so perhaps for the Easter Seals client, physical accessibility is one of their top priorities. If you can't get into the school, if you can't get into the classroom, if you can't take part in all of the educational opportunities in the school, then that's going to be a major consideration in terms of education. But this looked at far more features in terms of barriers to accessibility that are faced by students with disabilities. So there is a lot of things there around the IEP. And we've been talking tonight about the importance of parent advocacy. We want to strengthen that so that there are more mechanisms in place that you don't need to advocate, that they're going to be more proactive in reaching out to you, that there's going to be easy mediation. We've looked at the IPRC and said, what could be done to improve it? In fact, and our overwhelming decision was, we think it needs to be reviewed. Now, it wasn't within our mandate to review that, but we recommend that that's one of the first things that should be done by the Ministry of Education, is a review of the IPRC and the IPRC process. Really looking at, if we're going to service students with disabilities in Ontario, what are the best ways to do it? What are the most effective ways with the least amount of bureaucracy to get the supports to the student in the classroom so that we can have more success? Some of the other areas that it looked at was one of the blatant areas that's identified by a lot of people is around attitudes towards students with disabilities. I know myself, or as a parent of a child with cerebral palsy, the perception of people about cerebral palsy, their expectation that this is a person that is very physically involved, that does not, is intellectually impaired, has a developmental disability, can't speak for themselves. That's some of the attitudes and stereotypes and assumptions we hear about disability. And so there has to be some work in terms of educating both school staff, but also the peers around what a disability is. Just because somebody learns differently doesn't mean they don't have the same feelings. So when you don't include them or invite them to a birthday party, how that feels, it is just as hurtful for them as it would be for you. So a lot of recommendations around attitudes and perceptions and around the social realms in terms of the social life at school, which is so critical to our students. So tonight's session, we've been really focusing on the IEP and IPRC process because they are the most important. But we've heard that parents have a lot of other concerns about the education system and things that they would like, that they found as barriers. So is there anyone tonight that would like to share any barriers that they've identified that they would like some problem solving around? Robin? It seems like we have a very passive group. They want to hear information, but are not as...
That's fine. No, that's fine. There's a lot here. Let me offer just a couple of thoughts while people are thinking if they want to ask anything specific. The first is building on what Allison said about when you talk about accessibility. A lot of people think just about physical accessibility. Those of us who've been advocating to get the AODA passed and to get it implemented and so on, are happy that this legislation, the Accessibility for Ontarians with Disabilities Act, isn't just about physical disabilities. It's about all disabilities. So it could be a learning disability, could be intellectual disability, it could be a vision disability, a hearing disability. It could be a mental health condition. And kids aren't, don't come in isolated packages. Kids will have more than one disability. They might have a physical disability and a learning disability or a sensory disability. And we're trying to overcome a tendency to label and compartmentalize people. One of the problems in our school system that we're addressing is the old concept of special education doesn't serve kids with all disabilities. There are some disabilities that are not included within the Education Act's definition of who's entitled to special education. We've made recommendations that all students with disabilities should be protected and their learning needs should be met. This is an example of where I believe that all principals and teachers want to meet the needs of all kids, but they're handcuffed by a system that creates to a hierarchy, those kids whose disability counts and those whose doesn't, based on antiquated notions that predate our Charter of Rights. We've made some recommendations about how to fix this. And in that regard, I think it's fair to say that our report that came out yesterday is the most comprehensive attempt to look at Ontario's education system from top to bottom through the lens of what students with disabilities need. That's happened, I believe, in my lifetime. I think that school boards work in the system they're given. And the Ministry of Education has tended to tinker with the system we're given, but hasn't ever taken a look like we did at where are the barriers, what needs to be done, top to bottom. So it's an ambitious goal, but it's a long overdue goal and an exciting one. Finally, on the very specific thing, let me get very concrete. On the very specific thing Allison mentioned about physical accessibility. So for a number of Easter Seals clients, the issue of, hey, can my kid get in the school? Can they get around the whole school? I mean, I remember, and it's inexcusable that in the year 2021, I believe that the majority of schools, probably the clear majority of schools in the province of Ontario, built with public money, maintained with public money, are not fully accessible buildings. And I mean, I remember about 20 years ago hearing Rick Hansen on the radio coming to Mississauga because someone was building, they were about to call a school the Rick Hansen School because it was accessible. And I thought, why isn't that like every school? Why do we have to celebrate one where they do it right? Well, our report focused, among other things, on physical barriers. And one of the things we found out is that even though the government spends hundreds of millions of dollars on new schools every year, either building new ones or major renovations to existing ones, building additions, the provincial government did not have a standard for how to build an accessible school. You can build to the building code, but that never meets all accessibility needs. It's way out of date. So one of our subcommittees on our group, which I had the privilege of leading, we put together about a 20-page or 22-page list of what an accessible school should include. And that's part of our report. Now, I'm eager to hear back whether it'll meet all your needs, because if there's anything we left out, we want to know, because before we finalize our report, I want to fix it. But in the meantime, the moment this is now public, thankfully yesterday, we could turn to any school board that gets money from the province. Last summer, they announced a $500 million to build new schools and add additions to some. Those should comply with what we recommend. They should include what we put in that list of what's needed. We'll be eager to hear from you if we got it right or if there's anything we need to add. Back to you, Allison. Do we have any feedback yet from our in the chat?
Robin?
Nothing yet.
Okay, thank you. So one of the focuses this evening was around the IEP and IPRC, and they are very important processes currently in place, and you should be having your meetings this June. So one of the things that, one of the questions that was submitted is, I usually have the meeting. Will the meeting take place? Earlier, David talked about the fact that there should be less excuse because we have the option of virtual meetings. But we also are hearing that parents are being asked to waive their IPRC meeting. I know I have strong feelings about that. What do you have to say about waiving your right to have an IPRC?
If you don't need the IPRC, in other words, if you're happy where your child is placed and you don't want to have it changed, then there's no need to have one. And so there's no need for it. But if you want it reviewed, then no one should be telling you to waive it. If they say we think you should waive it, the answer is like no.
Well, I think where the confusion lies is sometimes they don't know what waive means.
Yeah,
When they
waive means I'm not going to have it.
Yeah, they don't understand what the document is in front of them. My recommendation, the same as David, is if everything is changed, to be the same for next year, the same placement, and you're comfortable with the decision, there probably is no need for an IPRC meeting, and you can waive your right. But if your child is going to change, for example, between elementary and secondary, change schools, if they're looking towards the final year of school, and changes that might be occurring as they plan for their post-high school life, these are important transition points where it may be very valuable to have an IPRC meeting to talk about what the placement options are going to be in the new facility.
What I would say is this: number one, I mean, I'm not in private practice, so I can't give legal advice, and you don't do it over YouTube anyway. But if you need advice on a request to waive a hearing, call Arch or see if you can find folks who can give you specialized advice in it. But I mean, I'll give you an illustration where I don't think you need it. If your child, for example, has a physical disability and the local school is accessible, and the child's going to school in the local school, and has certain accommodation or support needs. And then the IPRC only deals with whether the student should be placed in a different kind of school, a different kind of program, rather than where they are, rather than in a mainstream class in their local school. If you're not looking to change it, and they're not looking to change it, you don't need an IPRC to sit down and say, yeah, we're all happy. But the IEP is a critical piece to be the place, the document that will set out what supports your child gets. And that is something which you're going to want to take the advocacy steps that we've talked about.
Yeah, and I fully agree, David, that in terms of a placement which is stable, it's really looking at that IEP. Most of the IEP remains unchanged unless your child's needs have significantly altered. But if you have a special education program, for example, where they document the expectations for a modified program or for an alternative program, these should be changing on a regular basis. If they have set up their expectations for your child and what they're going to learn this semester, and they have learned it, then next semester you need to have different learning goals. So there should be parts of the IEP that change on a regular basis. Other parts, for example, your needs and strengths, that may stay consistent over time. So it is very important that if you aren't offered an IEP meeting this June, that you do ask for one, so you have that opportunity to discuss how successful they've been, what strategies have worked, and if it's not working, if your child's not making success, what other strategies they can put in place. So I think that that's why I strongly encourage people to have the IEPs. The other piece is in terms of as we talked about earlier, the return to school from remote learning. That adds a whole new dimension to the planning for students next year. One of the things that has not happened consistently this year is the access to therapists for prescriptions for individualized assistive technology or other specialized equipment. So that is something that may be a priority for the fall, that those assessors come in to really look at what equipment your child needs. Because if they're still using the equipment they were using in 2019, 2020, that could be 2 years out of date, the wrong size, and all those other things. So making sure that there's an opportunity to talk about your specialized equipment and when it's going to be reassessed, and making sure that it's available in the classroom. There was a real rush when we first went into remote learning last year to get families some of that specialized equipment in their homes. And in many homes, it may have done fine, but your child may have outgrown it. There may have been loss or damage. So that it needs to be a discussion about what equipment my child needs to be successful from the start of the school in September. We don't want to be waiting around for equipment. So the discussion about equipment is really important.
And by the way, part of what the world has learned over the past year, up until COVID, the general approach of the Ministry of Education, I am likely oversimplifying, was that provincially funded adaptive equipment was to remain at school. Then they realized that some of it needed to come home during distance learning. Well, in a world where kids do homework at home and where equipment schlepping back and forth, I mean, I'm not talking about an iPhone or an iPad, but more immovable stuff. I think the case is now even more overwhelming that having that learning equipment both at home and at school is important for kids when they're sick, when they're doing homework, and if distance learning is to be available. And because the province unfortunately is looking to make distance learning a permanent phenomenon for some learning options, the case for students with disabilities to have equipment provided that's at home and not just at school is an even stronger one.
Yeah, it's true. So only you know your child and your child's IEP and what things they were supposed to provide, what they may or may not have provided during remote learning, but most importantly, what they're going to need when they go back to school in September, whether it is for those that are choosing to be remote for the whole year or for those that are going back into the classroom. So planning, education planning is really important. I was hoping to open it up for discussion and questions, but at this point, Robin, do we have any questions to answer?
No questions.
One thing that I'm going to offer as an important take, because of the advocacy I've been involved in, and the coalition that I chair has been involved in, we deal with folks with all kinds of disabilities. And that gives me kind of a bird's eye, well, for a blind guy, a bird's eye view on the world. And one thing I've found for you parents is that having access to other parents who've been around the block, for whom this isn't their first rodeo, can be really helpful for you. And it's helpful for a couple of reasons. One, if they've done advocacy at the school board, they can give you some tips and tricks. The second is they know what it feels like. And if their child is in high school and yours is in elementary school, they will remember what they went through. And they may also have within if they're at your same school board, have some natural allies for you. And so I encourage you, like they may know people within the board who would, they've dealt with, who could be supportive and may get on the phone with you and give you some practical tips. So it's enormously helpful, whether through, in the case of some disabilities, they're formal organizations. There's an organization of parents of blind kids. There's an organization of parents of deaf kids. There's an organization of family members of kids with autism, and so on. It's usually useful to connect up with them and see if, and Facebook is enormously helpful for this. And also, thanks to the internet, it's worth looking internationally. Okay, I mean, I got to tell you, as a blind individual, I know there's some good blind advocacy organizations in Canada. In the States, there are a couple of ones that are frankly ginormous, and I've gone to their conferences, and they've got, like, before COVID, they'd have a couple of thousand blind people in a hotel. It's quite a blast. And I learned so much from them that I've brought back home. Well, you can look to communities elsewhere too. And with the new world of Zoom, there's also, oh, Allison, I don't think I've even talked about this. There's a new social media out there. If we have a minute, I'm going to tell you about it. You might think, all right, we got Facebook, we got Twitter, like enough already. But it's new, it's growing. I've gotten involved, and it's actually a really good platform for people, parents of kids with disabilities. It's called Clubhouse, Clubhouse. You don't post texts, you don't post pictures. It's exclusively for spoken word interaction. There's no video. So for example, I've been on a couple of groups of blind people getting together and talking about technology issues. I've seen there are parents of kids with autism who've gotten together. There are groups of special ed folks, and these are all around the world. I've actually co-chaired a couple of rooms where we talk about advocacy, disability advocacy, war stories, and lessons learned. And whether it's people in the States, Canada, and somebody on from Nigeria telling stories. So you might want to look at Clubhouse as just a way to get on, do a search for what clubs or rooms there are for parents of kids with disabilities, and you might be able to chat with people around the world on stuff. It's quite interesting and new. Back to you, Allison.
Thanks, David, for sharing that resource. So within Easter Seals, and another resource that we can tap into is that we have parent volunteers that sit on special education advisory committees with different school boards. So many of these parent volunteers have become experienced and knowledgeable about the school board, and they are, in fact, many of them effective advocates for their own child, and they have expertise that they're willing to share. So if you're interested in connecting or finding out, first of all, whether there is a parent volunteer on the SEAC at your school board, contact me and I can put you in touch with them, because quite a few of them are interested in getting into more direct contact with families, because that helps them to be better in terms of representing your interests at the board. And it also means that they can share some of the wealth of information that they've gathered with you. So if anyone is interested either in becoming a SEAC rep or connecting with a SEAC rep, please email me directly. All right. Without there being any questions, Robin?
No, still no questions.
All right. I'm wondering whether we have said enough for today, because we're not sure what other issues are out there, or if there's anything else we'd like to add. David?
Well, I'm just going to end with my a huge thank you, but also the commercial ad again. If you go to aodaalliance.org, www.aodaalliance.org, sign up to get our email updates, encourage other people to. Follow us on Twitter at AODA Alliance, and please retweet our tweets. And also check us out on Facebook, which is just under Accessibility for Ontarians with Disabilities Act with no spaces, committee with no spaces. And please be in touch, share our posts, and we welcome your feedback. And I want to thank Easter Seals for being such a, both for including me and for giving me the incredible opportunity to work with Allison over the past couple of years. It's been not only a lot of fun, but man, we have gotten into the details of how would you essentially take those handcuffs off the teachers and principals so they can do what they want to do for our kids. And it's been a tremendous learning experience.
It's true. And David and I have not always agreed, but one of the really big advantages of the committee was the fact that people were able to come to positions of compromise. That if we could understand what the objections were, we can nearly always find a solution that was acceptable to everybody. So that was one of the exciting pieces in that process. And so David and I were quite prepared on many issues to go head to head, but ultimately we did come to agreement on nearly every issue. So. And
you're still talking to me, which is great. No, really, we really had, what was fabulous, and I just want to share this with folks, is, you know, we had areas where a number of us took very different views, but we'd sit down and literally, okay, what's your beef? How about this? No, okay, what about this? And we'd work it out. And I don't think anything ever came to, in the end, I think everything passed very close to unanimously. And there was one issue came up on one particular thing, doesn't matter what, but it didn't pass. And so we went back to the drawing board, talked to anybody who voted against it, went back and forth, came up with a solution. And in the end, not only did it pass unanimously, but it was better than the one that was defeated from everybody's point of view. And so it was a really good consensus building exercise. And the thing that's very cool is the lion's share of that work took place either over Zoom or conference calls. It was all, the heavy lifting took place during the, pretty much during the pandemic.
It's true. So thank you very much for coming today, David. I hope to hear from some of the parents that listen to this presentation to let me know what else they would like in the future in terms of presentations, what information they would like to see shared on the Easter Seals Kids at School website. I'm constantly updating the articles there and adding new information. And so I'm very much interested to know how best we can support families in the area of special education.
Take care, everybody. Stay safe and get vaccinated.
Agreed. The sooner we can get back to normal, the better.
Take care.